Good evening, everyone. We are very happy that you came. I'm Karolina here from the gallery, and just a short introduction about us. Maybe a short introduction about you. Who is the first time here tonight? Okay. Thanks for coming. So this gallery is owned by the Czech Technical University in Prague since 2020, and this is our fifth exhibition. We opened last summer, and we are actually super proud of this exhibition and happy to deal with this topic. And basically this is an exhibition framework, Spaces Evidence, which lasts from 8th of October until 2nd of February, fingers crossed. And it works on with additive concept. So we started in October with a project by Forensic Architecture and Forensis and their long-term research on the German colonial period in Namibia. And specifically we exhibit a project from the second phase of this research project focused on the massacre in Hortkrans, which happened in 1893, because they also studied how it impacted the landscape and thus showing how architectural research method can help prove how it impacts the environmental rights. And today or tonight we continue with the opening of second project by Alison Killing, which was an investigative journalistic project. I'll get to it a bit later. And in a couple of weeks, on the 27th of November, we will actually continue with the third project by Beirut Urban Lab, which studies the current conflict. So stay tuned. We hope that a representative from this research collective will be also able to come in person and present their current research. And in the meantime, there will be also one Czech researcher presenting research in one Slovak town, and they studied how urban planning and urban policies can cause segregation of a certain house in this Slovak town, and they also try to work with forensic architecture methods. So that will happen on the 14th of November, and then on the 4th of December. We will have an online lecture by a representative of the Center for Spatial Technologies who did a research on the Mariupol drama theater and its destruction. So stay tuned. We are very much looking forward to it, and now I'll get to tonight. So this research on the network of detention camp in Xinjiang in China was conducted between 2019?
Yeah, 2019.
2019, and in 2021 it received the Pulitzer Prize for this investigative project, and it was done in collaboration of architect Alison Killing, who will give a talk, and the journalist Megha Rajagopalan, who is here tonight as well and will join the Q&A, so don't hesitate to ask. I think it was very exciting. And then there was also Kristo Buček, software developer who helped them as well. And now I will give the mic to Alison, and we're really happy that you and Megha can join us tonight, and thank you very much.
Cool.
Enjoy.
Cool. Thanks, and thanks to Karolina and the team for having us and for allowing us to show this exhibition again. So, as you said, our team worked on this from middle of 2018 to 2019 onwards, and for about 3 years. So, Xinjiang is this large region in the northwest of China. It's home to a number of of Muslim, or of ethnic minorities who largely practice Islam. It's and since sort of 2016, 2017, there's been this very serious campaign of oppression there, which many countries around the world, from the US, the UK, I think the Czech Republic as well, Canada, the Netherlands, have described as a genocide. The reasons that this is going on, so Xinjiang was only incorporated into China relatively recently. It was incorporated into China about 250 years ago, but then even then only loosely. It was governed by warlords. And throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, it had a series of periods of independence. And then was incorporated into the PRC in 1949 after the Civil War. It's a region that is geopolitically very important to China because it connects to 8 other countries in Central Asia, and it's in a key position on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's initiative to link China over sea and over land to Central America, to Central Asia, and to Europe. It also has a lot of resources, so it produces a lot of the world's cotton, it produces a lot of tomatoes, it has oil and coal. And then at the same time, many of the people who live there, the Uyghurs are the largest group who you've probably heard of, but there's also Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Mongols, Xibe, Hui, and others, many of whom have cultures and languages and religious practices which are distinct from the Han ethnic majority in China. And all of those things taken together make the Chinese government very nervous. For several decades, people in Xinjiang have had this very challenging relationship with the Chinese state. There's been a lot of discrimination in terms of education and in terms of employment. There have been intermittent crackdowns on the practice of religion. And over the past sort of 10, 15 years, this escalated. There were protests in response to what was seen as Chinese repression, which in many cases turned violent. And the Chinese government came to see this region as a place which was violent, which wanted to break away, which was full of a group of people who they saw as having been radicalized and, in many cases were involved in terrorism. And that was the reasons that, as well as its geopolitical importance, that they wanted to try and clamp down and sort of gain a tighter grip on this region. And so from about 10 years ago, the way that started to play out, and I should say that in many cases what they saw as evidence of radicalism was actually benign displays of religious practice, of people who grew beards, of people who, women who wore hijab, going to the mosque regularly. Religion was seen as a key indicator that somebody had been radicalized and was extreme and was against the Chinese state. And so from about 2013 onwards, we started to see the start of this escalation. And it started with the introduction of a lot of surveillance measures. So this was a street in Kashgar, a photograph that was taken in mid-2017. And if you look closely, you can see the big camera that's right in the foreground, but look more closely and you can see about 5-10 further surveillance cameras just in this one small section of street. So there was a lot of CCTV that was introduced. Checkpoints would be set up throughout towns every 50, even to 200 meters, basically at every intersection through a town, where people would have to stop, they would have to show ID, explain where they were going to the police. They might have to get their bags scanned, they might get their irises scanned, they may have their phone checked for apps that shouldn't be there, like Western apps like WhatsApp, for example, for music or videos from the Middle East. And so this was both incredibly intimidating and incredibly disruptive to the practice of everyday life. And from about 2016 onwards, a new official who had been the head of the Communist Party in Tibet was given that same role in Xinjiang. He'd led the crackdown in Tibet, and when he moved to this region, we very quickly started to see a further escalation in the oppression of Muslim minorities there. So what happened from about 2016 was that there was the growth of what became this absolutely huge detention program. In the beginning, we saw that like hospitals and schools were being converted into camps. And shortly afterwards, like a large program of construction began to build purpose-built facilities. And this started in the end of at the end of 2016. By sort of spring of 2017, there were rumors starting to emerge that hundreds of thousands of people had been disappeared into this detention camp network, and just like nobody knew where they were. Like nobody knew where these camps were. Researchers started to try and investigate. They had some successes using procurement documents, where they found adverts that the Chinese government had put out advertising for guards for these camps, and those adverts would have an address of the facility, and they could then go and look up that address, find that place in satellite imagery, and find some of the camps. And so by 2018, a few dozen of these places had been found. We knew that they really did exist. And we knew what some of them looked like. But middle of 2018, it was estimated that there were 1 million people who were being detained. And that was seen as a conservative figure. And it was estimated that there were 1,200 of these camps in existence. And the UN was describing what was happening in Xinjiang as one of the world's most urgent human rights crises. And yet still, policymakers lacked evidence of what was happening there. And so Megha, who is here tonight and is going to be joining us for the Q&A, she had been working in China for several years by this point. She'd worked for Reuters as a political correspondent, and then she'd moved to BuzzFeed News to be the China bureau chief. And in 2017, she started to look into this subject of the camps. She was able to, through some people who used to live in the region, she'd managed to find out where one of the camps was. They managed to show it to her on Google Earth. And so she was able to go to Kashgar and visit one of these camps. And she was the first journalist to actually do so. She published this article in September 2017, and shortly afterwards, the Chinese government decided that they weren't going to renew her visa. And we're invited to believe that those two things aren't connected. But then the following summer, 2018, she and I met at a workshop. Now, my background is as an architect. I worked in commercial practice at the start of my career, doing structural engineering, doing architecture, doing urban planning. But I had started to move much more towards documentary and to journalism. And I'd done quite a lot of work with satellite imagery and with mapping. And from Megha's first experience in finding this camp, she had the idea that satellite images could be a useful way to investigate what was happening further. And I had those skills, and so we decided to team up and start working together and just see what we could find. And over the next couple of months, I would occasionally put a couple of hours into thinking about this problem. And we looked at a lot of things. We thought about, can we use machine learning and AI? We quite quickly rejected that. Machine learning is really good when you have a picture and you want to know, does this image have a tree in it, or does it not? Or does this image have a picture of a building in it, or does it not? But it's much less good at finding these sort of complex compounds that we were looking for. And so we quite quickly moved on from the machine learning idea. And then at one point, I read this article in Wired that was talking about, it was about a photographer who was based in Shanghai. And he had realized that in Baidu Total View, which is the Chinese equivalent of Google Street View, that the ground level imagery was being manipulated. So this is an industrial facility just outside of Shanghai, and someone has like gone into this imagery and used Photoshop and clumsily like painted sky across the cooling tower. And there were a number of instances of this happening. And I was like, well, if they're doing this with industrial estates in the east of China, like potentially they're doing something similar with the camps in Xinjiang. And so I wanted to have a look at the imagery there to see what I could find. There were a number of camps that journalists had visited, so we were really sure that they were camps. And I wanted to look at those locations to see what Baidu showed. But when I went there, actually there was no street view imagery in those locations. There was just the satellite imagery. And so I was like playing around with this and like zooming in and out and panning around. And I noticed this really strange thing was happening, that like as I was zooming in, there was this like white square that would appear, and then like I would zoom in further and it would disappear, and you would just have this satellite. There was no satellite imagery close in. You would just get grey reference map tiles, which is like the grey map tiles that just have like outlines of buildings and the road as a line. And so it like at first it just kind of felt like the map wasn't loading properly, that the internet was being slow or something. But I was like panning around and zooming in and out a bit more, and I realized this same thing kept happening. And it shouldn't have, because if the map had loaded once, like those tiles should have been in the browser's cache. So you shouldn't get this same issue manifesting. And so I was like, okay, this is weird. And then I went to look at the other locations that we knew to be camps, and I found the same thing happening, that we were getting this white square appearing just at this one zoom level, right at the location of the camp. And once I realized that I could replicate this, I was like, okay, we've got this, we've got a technique that we can use to find the rest of the network, that we can go and find these white squares, then go and look at the same locations in Google Earth and see what's there, and we might be able to find the full camp network in that way. And so we started working with a friend of mine, a friend of ours, called Christo Bushek, who's a developer who specializes in human rights projects, and had a really strong security background as well. And we worked with him to map all of the mask tiles across Xinjiang. This is the locations for like the southern half of Xinjiang, shown in QGIS. When he did that work, I thought that he was going to maybe find maybe 500,000 locations, something like that. And in fact, he found 5 million, which was like quite sobering, because there was just like, there's no way that you can search through 5 million locations. And what was happening was that this censorship was actually being applied to anything that had strategic value across Xinjiang. So it was solar panel arrays, it was wind farms, electricity substations, electricity, power plants, industrial estates, military training areas, military bases, and then like these camps and prisons as well. So we needed to get this data set down from this like huge number to something that we could start to actually work with. And the way that we made this smaller was to say like, okay, we know that there are some things that the camps need in order to be built and in order to function. So we know that if you're going to get building materials to this place, if you're going to build something, you need to get building materials there, you need to get heavy construction equipment, you need to get the workers there. These places have to be close to infrastructure to transport those. And then on the other hand, like once they're built, they still need other things. They need like water and gas and electricity and internet. And it's much easier to connect to an existing municipal system than it is to dig a channel 300 miles into the desert. So probably these places are near like towns and cities. Other reasons that they would need to be near cities is that, well, you need people to be put into the camps, but you also need guards and other staff to work there. And those people need places to live, and they have families, and their children need to go to school, so probably these places are next to, for all those reasons, probably these places are next to urban areas. And so we drew out those, we mapped out the main infrastructure, we mapped out the main urban areas, drew a buffer around, and then we're like, okay, those are the locations we're going to look at. And that took it down from 5 million mask tiles to look at to 50,000. And from there, I could start working fairly systematically. So I started in Kashgar, which is in the southwest of Xinjiang. Kashgar is the Uyghur heartland. It's the heart of Uyghur culture. It has the largest Uyghur population, so it made sense to start our search there. And over a week, I went through 10,000 locations. At the end of that week, I'd learnt a couple of things. One was that I had a really good sense of what these places looked like, and the other was that I knew where they tended to be. So the way that we did this analysis, Christo built a tool for us to work with that would allow us to sort through all of the mask tile locations. It was built on top of Google Maps, and what I could do was to go through and mark each of the mask tile locations and click through it and just be like, no, there's nothing there, and it would move on to the next. No, there's nothing there. No, there's nothing there. And it could help me to keep track of where I'd looked, and would also allow me to put in markers where I found anything suspicious that I could come back to later. So this is the tool that he built that connected to a database, and which we used to do a lot of, that we used to keep track of what we were doing and finding and thinking, and that really helped us to do this analysis. So after this week of work, I knew what the camps more or less looked like, and I also had a sense of where they tended to be. A lot of them were in industrial estates on the edge of cities, and that was for the reasons that we had expected, that we had suspected. You've got land there, and you've also got access to the water and internet and electricity, and it's easy for people to get to from the towns. So after that, I started to search much more organically. I kept a track of each county in Xinjiang and what I'd found there. And what we were finding was that in each county there was one camp and there was one detention system and one detention center. And so I'd keep a track of what I'd found, and if there was a county where I hadn't found anything yet, then I knew that I needed to keep looking, because almost certainly there was going to be a camp and a detention center there. And in this way, we found what we believed to be close to the full network of camps across the region. As I was doing this work, Megha was doing a lot of work to interview former detainees and to corroborate our findings in that way. So the way that we corroborated was, in some cases we had camps which, in some cases we had camps where we had government documents, like the adverts for the guards, or tenders for contractors to put in a new central heating system. Sometimes we had media reports, and we also often had eyewitness reports. So that gave us a really good basis of camps that we knew for certain were camps, and we knew what they looked like. And from there we could build out to the ones where we just had satellite imagery, but they looked very, very similar, and we could say okay, we don't have the same level of corroborating evidence, but this looks very similar to all of the places where we do have that strong evidence. And then what was amazing was that as we went, we started to find more corroborating evidence. We published for the first time in August in 2020, and then in 2021 we'd continued to work on this, And I woke up one Monday morning in like November 2021, and there was this video that had been doing the rounds on Chinese language social media. And I woke up to a load of messages on this Monday morning saying like, hey, you've got to see this video. And what had happened was that this man who we think is Chinese and who goes by the name of Guan Guan, and who was, up until that point, had spent a lot of time doing a video blog and doing cycling journeys across China. He had gone to Xinjiang, and he'd taken the map from our article and then used it to drive around the region, visiting some of these locations to see what was there. And it was truly incredible what he did. It was we talk about the video and we show more of it in the video that we've made for the exhibition. But he starts off and he's got this camera on his dashboard, and he's just like driving down a road past the camp, and you sort of like see it off to the side, and we can like stop and freeze frame and see like, yes, it really is the camp that we thought it was. And then he starts to like get a little bit to take a little bit more risk and also become a bit braver. There's one camp that's down a side street, and he doesn't really have a reason to go down that side street, but he goes to the shop that's on the corner and he buys something, and then he like gets back in his car and drives down the side street and pretends that he's just turning around, but he's getting footage of this detention center, and then he drives off. And then he goes to Urumqi, which is the capital, and there's a large number of prisons there. And at that point, he was like getting out of his car and like walking down the street, taking this footage with the camera in his backpack. And he went out on wasteland where he could get a better view of some of these places to provide this video documentation. And then, like the last part, he drives from Urumqi down to a place called Dabancheng, which and it's the site of like the largest detention facility that we know of. We think it's big enough to hold around 40,000 people. So it's huge. It's like, it would make it one of the biggest detention facilities in the world. And it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And he's driving down the motorway, and then he drives off and he goes down this, he pulls off and like drives up this dirt track onto a piece of wasteland, and then he climbs up on this earth berm that overlooks this camp. And it was, and then he's like lying there with his phone out, filming what he can see over the top. And he produced like the first images that we have of this place. And helped us to corroborate that a number of these places really were camps. He was exceptionally brave. He had absolutely no plausible deniability for being there. Like, there was no other reason for him to be there other than that he was filming a camp. And he took a real huge risk to get this video out. We think that by the time he posted the video that he was safely outside of China. But we were able to use the footage that he'd produced and verify it using satellite imagery, that you could identify like key features in the photographs, and then by looking like at what they must have looked like from above, looking at the relationship between those different elements, we could prove that he really had been where he said he was. Like once we had found this network of camps, we still had a lot more questions, and we still had a lot more investigating that we wanted to do. We wanted to find out, what was it like inside? What was day-to-day life like inside? And this led us to start to like model one of the camps in 3D. This is a camp in Mongolkure, which is a place close to the Kazakh border. And unusually, we knew of 3 detainees, former detainees who had been held here. And so what we started to do with this was, Megha was doing interviews with these people. I was starting from the satellite imagery and trying to, and working with what I had, working with, this imagery which gave me a ground plan and gave me some measurements, and working with my architectural knowledge to try and build a 3-dimensional model of this camp. And so I could get quite a long way because I had the footprints. We had some satellite images that were taken at an angle that allowed us to see the facades. And so I got quite a long way, and then at a certain point I started to have questions about wait, but what's happening inside here? And that's where this model and the interviews that Megha were doing started to really come together. So one of the things that I first wanted to know was because I could see what the pattern of windows was on the facade, so I could tell what the structural grid ought to be in this building, and I could guess at what the layout was as well, just that it was full of cells, probably down a central corridor, but we didn't know how big the rooms were, and so this was one of the questions that we had for the detainees. Well, how many windows were there in the cell that you were kept in? And they were like, oh, there was one of them. And so using that, suddenly we knew exactly how big these cells were. And because we had also got the Chinese prison building regulations, and they tell us, they gave us a few key pieces of information, one of which was, this is the number of square meters in the complex that each detainee should have. And so we could work out what the capacity of this building ought to be. And then from the interviews, we learned that in each cell there were 10 people in a space that our research had told us was really only big enough for 3. So we could quantify the overcrowding. That there were 3 times as many people in there as there should have been. And the overcrowding was something that we were told about in all of these places. Similarly, there was in the satellite imagery, I'd been able to see these barbed wire pens in the courtyard outside the buildings, and I wanted to know what was happening there, and that became the basis for a really useful conversation about. We learned a few things. We learned that those pens were exercise yards for the detainees. We learned that actually they didn't go to them very often, that people were kept in the cells for the majority of the time, for 23 hours a day, and that it was only every few weeks, every 6 weeks or so, that people actually got to go outside. And there were a series of different enclosures, and those different enclosures were for people who had different security classifications. Many of the people that we spoke to were classified in the lowest security risk, but there were other people who were classified as much higher risk and were kept under much stricter conditions. But we were able to talk also with the model about details of what it was like to be in those cells. The detainees told us that there was CCTV which was able to monitor every corner. There were also speakers and microphones in the cells. People often weren't allowed to speak their own first language, whether that was Riga or whether that was Kazakh or something else. They were expected to speak Mandarin at all times. And if they didn't, then the guards could hear it over via the microphones and could yell at them via the speakers in their cell. So people were in this very, very strictly controlled environment. And it was a huge amount of psychological pressure. People were mistreated. We heard accounts of people being beaten. People didn't have enough food. They were denied medical treatment. But in many cases, people told us or what people spoke about as being one of the toughest things was the psychological pressure that they were under, that they were expected to sit for long hours on these small plastic stools. They had to sit fully upright. They had to study Chinese Communist Party propaganda. They would be yelled at if they slouched. And just as they walked down corridors, they had to like follow a line that was painted on the floor. And they had very, very little proper stimulation. And that psychological mistreatment was very, very tough for people. Also just the fact that many of the people targeted for detention, the Chinese government had said that they said by 2018 they were admitting that this camps program did exist. They denied it up to that point. But by 2018 they were saying that, like, look, it does exist, but this is an educational program. We're taking people who don't speak Chinese, don't really have like skills, and we're teaching them Mandarin. We're teaching them like skills that will allow them to get well-paid factory jobs. And this is like a voluntary program. This is great. And we're also, some of them have been radicalized. It's terribly sad. We're helping to like bring them back and get them back on the right track. None of that was true. Many of the people who, for starters, people were brought there under like heavily coerced circumstances. They would be arrested in the middle of the night. They would be taken away in chains with bags over their heads. Many of the people who were targeted were highly educated, already spoke fluent Mandarin. In fact, the people who we understand to have been arrested first were the people who played really key roles in Uyghur society. So it was like imams, teachers, it was university professors, especially people who studied language and culture, business leaders, people who'd held positions in government. And so it was really damaging to Uyghur society that these were the people removed and taken to these camps. Many of the people in the camps, they really struggled with, they'd been good upstanding citizens all their lives, and suddenly they found themselves in prison for, many of them many weren't told what they had done. In fact, when we found leaks, we learnt what many of the people had been detained for, and it would be, very benign displays of religious observance. So, growing a beard, wearing hijab, going to the mosque, reading the Quran, having travelled overseas, having relatives overseas. These were all reasons that people ended up in the camps. And many people really struggled with the fact that, having been real upstanding citizens, that they'd found themselves in prison and they just couldn't wrap their heads around what had happened or why. And so the psychological pressure of being in the camps was something that has affected people very strongly. We were also able to model quite a lot of the camp and to find out quite a lot of things about what happened there. Often people would spend a huge amount of time in their cells, also eating there. Although there was supposed to be an educational function to these places and there was a classroom, people didn't go there that often, I think just because there wasn't the space. When they did, there was a screen at the front which was to protect the teacher from these apparently dangerous prisoners. I'll just show you this one last thing. And that's we spent some time looking at this one camp, but another question that we wanted to answer was firstly, we found these 350 or so facilities. Have we found them all? And and this 1 million people that we believe to be detained, can we do further analysis that might help us to to look at that question more closely, like, is there anything that we can say about this? And so what we started to do was to draw out all of the camps and draw out the floor plans and to calculate the gross floor areas. We had the Chinese prison building regulations that told us the meters squared per detainee, and so we were able to just like add up these gross floor areas and divide it by that number to work out what the capacity was of the prison system. And we were able to do that per camp. We also categorized all of the building by the month that it was built in. And so we were able to like track the changes in the program over time and across the region to work out which areas were targeted. What we found was that since 2016 there has been space built to hold just over 1 million people, and that's 1 million people without overcrowding. We heard of overcrowding in almost all of the instances in which we spoke with people. And we found as well that it was in fact, we were able to like analyze that data quite closely as well. We found that most of the camps focused on Kashgar and on the areas of Xinjiang which had the largest Uyghur populations, and that it was in those places that the program first started. So I'll stop there, I think. We can maybe do some Q&A. Megha has like tons of knowledge as well, like about. I focused very much on like the data, on the satellite imagery. Megha has spent a lot of time in China and spent a lot of time talking with these former detainees. So, yeah.
So I should have had the question. Yeah, thanks a lot. Really thanks a lot for the project and for the talk. Actually, I had a question about the former detainees and related to the organization of the camps. So I imagine this is super hard to actually get the people who have gone through these camps, right? And I obviously don't want you to disclose their identities or anything, but those would be mostly people who actually have managed to left China, or was it like, because under the conditions of authoritarian Chinese system now, I can imagine this would be super risky with anonymous, right? So maybe just broadly you could say a few more things about that. And second, relatedly, if based on the testimonies that you managed to actually gather, if you would say there are differences between different camps, basically, or if there is a kind of template which, to our knowledge, is kind of applied uniformly throughout the whole region. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to let Megha answer that. She's like,
yeah.
yes. Oh, sorry, Megha's here.
If anyone, I don't think that way, but if anyone can't hear me, just say so. But I'll let you take the second one. It's a really good question on the detainees. So basically, what happened was in the beginning of this campaign, around 2017, 2018, there was like this huge push to where all of these like local authorities just started detaining tons and tons of people at once. Like the people described these like really chaotic scenes of being taken from their house in the dead of night. They would show up at these camps. There would be like huge scrums of people that were being processed to get inside the camps. It was very chaotic. And amidst this, in the kind of heavily Kazakh areas of Xinjiang, there were a number of people, like I think probably ranging from like a few hundred to like a few thousand, people who were detained who actually held Kazakh passports. And some of them, if they didn't hold Kazakh passports, they had green cards, or they had a Kazakh spouse, or they had some connection to Kazakhstan, right? There were a lot of others who were Kazakh by ethnicity, but had no connection to the country. So when the Kazakh government found out this was happening, they sort of engaged in this like kind of quiet diplomacy program on behalf of some of their citizens and people that were associated with them. And that, to my understanding, that led to some number of people being released. Those people were then able to resettle in Kazakhstan under the Kazakh government's policy to resettle people with Kazakh heritage, like no matter where they're from in the world. Once they got there, it was still really, really difficult for journalists to talk to them. Obviously, within Xinjiang, it was pretty much impossible because of the level of surveillance. You really couldn't go in and interview people at all. So by the time people were resettling in Kazakhstan, there were some NGOs that were working with them. A lot of these detainees, as you might imagine, had really severe physical health problems, mental health problems, just from having undergone this experience. They were really struggling. A lot of them had family still in Xinjiang. They were worried about repercussions. They were worried about blowback. But after a while, like after a year or two had passed, there were a number of people that sort of decided that if they didn't speak out about this, then it might be that the world would never know about this. And those people exercised a tremendous amount of courage. In our reporting, I think the majority of them spoke anonymously or with different degrees of anonymity. Some people did use their names. You know, we have in our series like photographs of people, and you can see over there as well. You know, people that were brave enough to even put their faces to it, which I thought was really incredible. But we really owe a debt to those people. I think it was for us as journalists going into this, like, I think the drawback was they represented a certain group of people, you know, people that already had a connection to another country, which Uyghurs do not, because there's no Uyghur country. So, and also people that were from one particular ethnic minority were from one part of the region. So it sort of limited the perspective, but we were also grateful just to have any perspective at all on that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, it does seem that there's been a pretty consistent experience throughout the region. Like through all, I mean, so there's a large group of people in Kazakhstan who have been through this, who have managed to escape, who have been willing to talk. There are pockets of like small communities elsewhere around the world, in Turkey, in some parts of Europe, in the US. The people who have also been willing to speak out, and then those people have like come from like all over the region. The testimony that we've heard and that we've seen others gather has been remarkably similar, like across the region and across the years of the detention program. And also there's been a series of leaked documents which have come from, you know, like the highest echelons of the Chinese government, which lay out like how the camp program should be run. So yeah, we've seen that from sort of like two levels, from like the testimony on the ground and then also like the Chinese government laying out what should happen. So yeah.
So on one hand, it seemed like that the China states tried to cover the proofs in the maps and in the street views and stuff, but on the other hand, it didn't, like, it was so stupidly done that it appeared not to be such a problem with maybe Christo or like with the skills you had to actually find those proofs. So, like, have you been worried of anything during the process or after it was published, or like how did you work with some security of like those who did the research, and maybe of course the former prisoners or things? So like, do you think it was really important for the Chinese state to keep it secret, or it wasn't that important and they were aware that at some point it will be somehow public?
I I think they really wanted to keep it secret. I mean, like, Megha has like direct experience with this, but like there was,
there was also this guy with this YouTube video that he made it, like, I think he was aware that he's in danger.
Yeah.
And you also commented on it in the video we exhibited that it was very brave to do it. So, like, how brave was to do it?
I will say, like, just on the censorship thing, like, there's a nuance there that's important, which is that basically Baidu, which is the Google equivalent in China, is a private company. It's not a state-owned company, right? So basically what had happened is that some Chinese government apparatus said to Baidu, you need to censor all of this stuff. And not just the camps and prisons, but as Alison said, like, you know, military facilities and like sort of lots of other kinds of places, right? And it probably wasn't just happening in Xinjiang, it was probably happening all over the country. And then somebody at Baidu had a job that they had to censor it, and they were like, well, we'll just slap some white tiles over it. That's like my assessment of why it was done in such a ham-handed way. I do think that they definitely wanted to keep it secret, but I think in my experience in China, like the kind of level of sensitivity is so high that this isn't even the beginning of what they want to keep secret, that there's just like so much stuff that's like that, that I think probably they thought, like, you know, we're just going to kind of apply a very broad brush to it.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing that we were worried about when we were doing this project was that we would lose access to the information that we needed to do the research. So having realized that this thing was happening in Baidu, we had to go out and find funding to do the work. Open Tech Funds stepped in and funded us, but we went through a long period of talking with them, and it was all in like encrypted emails and which is a real pain, through like encrypted emails, encrypted messaging apps. We were like very, very cautious in our communication because we just couldn't afford to have it get out that this is what we wanted to do and have it taken down before we got the chance to scrape it. Christo also has a strong background in cybersecurity, so he was also able to do this work in a way that hopefully wouldn't draw attention to itself as he was like mapping the tiles, and also to then keep it secure on a server that, to prevent it. Well, also to prevent it from being hacked or stolen or anything like that. So that was actually our biggest concern. But I'll let Megha talk about the security concerns with talking with sources.
Right. The source security was like a big problem, but I think that there was like one lucky break, which is that a lot of the travel I did before the first lockdowns in the pandemic, and if we'd waited, we really would have been screwed. But for the most part, not completely, but almost everyone, we met repeatedly and in person, and the appointments were like brokered by a third party, basically. So that sort of that like helped with a lot of the security stuff, just to meet in a place that was like trusted, and also not to do it digitally. Like there was a lot of anxiety about doing it digitally. Alison and I were talking back and forth this whole time, like, you know, as I was doing the reporting, and then she would find something on a map and I would have my laptop open to Google Earth and like have people point things out. I had people like physically draw things, and then I would go back to Alison and she would sort of find the layouts and the satellite imagery. We would try to compare back and forth. There were a couple of people, like a few people actually, that I kept in touch with just on like encrypted messenger, and we did like we sort of tried our best to do like disappearing messages, encryption. There was still like, we just didn't know, right? Like there was just like a lot of anxiety about it. But I think like for my approach, like I basically thought like, you know, the people that are coming to us about this are like, that are willing to talk, really want their stories to be told. They want people to know about this in a big way. And I can't make that risk calculus for them, but I can tell them what the risk is. I can make sure it's clear. And I just tried my best to do that, to like let them know that this is going to come up on Google results. You have to there's like layers of layers of anonymity here. Like you can be completely anonymous. You can have your name but not your photo. You can have your town in it or not in it. Like, we can anonymize certain details. And we were lucky that BuzzFeed sort of allowed us to do that. And I think that worked really well from a security perspective.
Sorry, one last thing. I just imagine that if a team of 3 people achieve this, then like teams of like the, how do you call it, the state securities, teams like China's or any country cannot have any secret. Like
they're getting a lot smarter, I think.
I mean, but it didn't seem that difficult. Or like, of course, there was a lot of work.
Yeah.
But you manage it as an architect, software developer, and a journalist, which is amazing.
And maybe 0.1 things that are such in China, or like it's very small amount. But I think that we can see here. Sorry for interrupting, but like I think it's such a small amount that we cannot talk about that we can find it all if we want. I think we cannot.
I guess like my opinion on this as like a person that's covered China like on and off since 2011, 2012 is that like basically this issue between the Chinese government and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang it's not new. This has been going on since 1949 when the communists took power. Right, in various iterations. Like in the entire time that I lived in China, there were different iterations of this conflict. There was a period where there were terrorist attacks that the government blamed on Uyghur separatist groups. There was a period where Uyghurs were sort of fleeing the country en masse, like through the southern border, and would go through Southeast Asia to Turkey. There was like there were periods of religious crackdown and riots, and also of loosening. And during that whole time, most of the world had no idea what this place was, or that there was a group of people called the Uyghurs. Nobody cared. And when 2017 happened, things started getting worse in a really big way. And like, I really believe that the government thought, like, who the hell is gonna care if we start repressing these people like a little more than we did before? This is not like a conflict zone that is known, that at that time was like a big political issue. We're looking back on it now that it's a big global issue, but when we started doing this, like nobody knew about it. And our work also coincided with this time period where the US was in this kind of like tough on China mindset. It was in the news a lot, and a lot of the European countries became more interested in it. And the fact that this is a major human rights atrocity also went along with a lot of criticisms that other countries had about China. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think the reason that they didn't maybe put as much effort into the cover-up as perhaps they could have is because they probably didn't think that it was going to become a huge diplomatic issue, and then it did, I think.
Maybe can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
What you were saying, I was wondering, after you triggered and opened up the Pandora's box, what has happened after? If the UN, Human Rights Watch, and these organizations started focusing on it, if the leadership kind of started to make some pressure, or what's your observation? What has been happening and where it's going, and if there is any chance actually right now, any relevant chance that the detainees or imprisoned people in such brutal conditions who can come to some freedom or to another state maybe.
I mean, there were, at the time that we were working, there were others working. There were other reporters from other news organizations working on this. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty were following it closely and were putting out really good research on it, and a number of academics as well. Since we published, we've seen action on a number of levels. We've seen sanctions of key officials in the Chinese government. We've seen sanctions on goods coming from Xinjiang, especially in the US, and they started off targeting cotton and tomatoes, which were some of the biggest exports, and then they widened it to say, look, anything that is coming from Xinjiang, the burden of proof is on the importer to prove that there was no forced labor in this thing coming into the country. So there's very strict sanctions from the US, which have been largely successful. Much less so in Europe. Europe has a very, very weak sanctions regime and very weak enforcement. A number of countries have made statements that they believe that this is a genocide, which is important in international law terms because it comes with an obligation to act. And the other thing that we saw was a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in 2022, which sounds like maybe like less meaningful, but China does care about its image. And so it was very significant that a number of countries decided to take the chance to like offend China by not going to the Olympics, or by not making sort of like formal representation there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess just on an individual level, I mean, I think some of our reporting has contributed to reuniting individual families and getting people out in very isolated cases, and then and also like better treatment for high-profile dissidents. So I think those are like kind of the concrete impacts. I think in terms of like the larger kind of diplomatic impacts, I would say like we share credit with like lots of people that have worked on this, and like Alison said, including the human rights groups and diplomats and policymakers and other journalists.
Any good question?
Sorry. It's just maybe a silly question and very simple one, but and you talked about it a little bit, but maybe we can talk closer about the reasons why people are in these camps. Like what all reasons, why are they there? If the reason is that they are Muslims, or if they are Kazakh people, or like what's the thing? And if it's this reason, what's the problem? China has a problem with this kind of people. If they are like worried that they will, I don't know, do a revolution or something, because they are like different, or what they are worried about this is basically just
so I would say so obviously China is controlled by the Communist Party. Their ethnic majority is called Han Chinese. So since they came to power, they've had this kind of policy of sinicization. So basically what it means is that in parts of the country where there are ethnic minorities, they have worked to basically like flood those places. Like basically they incentivize Han Chinese people to move there and start businesses and basically try to change the population to be more Han Chinese. So that's sort of the first iteration of that. They perceive a lot of these ethnic minorities as being separatist. And in the case of Uyghurs specifically, they perceive them as being militant, anti-state, and separatist. So, and it's true that they're either, I mean not is, but there was a separatist movement in Xinjiang. A lot of those people, I think almost all of them are exiled now. But that was certainly seen as a threat to the government. There was this string of bombings and knife and bomb attacks that happened around 2013, 2014 that the Chinese government blamed on Uyghur separatists. The reason I say blamed is because there's never been an independent examination of that. But I mean, largely believe that that's what happened. So the government has basically used these incidents that were obviously committed by a handful of people that were all arrested and put to death pretty much, to tar this entire group of like millions of people, right? So it's a question of collective guilt. Like more concretely, like why do people actually get detained in these camps? Alison talked a bit about this. Like there's been some leaked documents that give like basically have this database like where there's like lists of reasons. So like the most like low level reasons that we found are like using apps that are banned in China. So like WhatsApp is banned, right? Facebook is banned. If you have this on your phone and your phone is getting checked at a checkpoint and like put into a scanner, they'll find that you have it. Having photos on your phone of like a mosque. I interviewed someone who had been to Turkey and visited the Hagia Sophia, and he took a photo of the Hagia Sophia. He got detained. like having any relatives who live abroad, particularly in Muslim countries, including places like Malaysia, Indonesia, that are like relatively secular. Like all subjects were concerned, having studied abroad. So those are kind of like the lower level things. The higher level, like quote unquote crimes, would be things like people who were imams, people who were politically active, people who were active on social media talking about politics. So like all of those, like you might get detained, you might even get a prison sentence. Generally, we found that people who were detained were like kind of like below the age of like 60. They were generally adults. There were other things that were happening to children, like being rehomed and stuff that we didn't get into, but yeah, it was like mainly that age group. It was sort of branded, as Alison said from the beginning, as this idea of re-education, and what that means in this context is that they are trying to kind of eliminate their culture, their religion, and homogenize them. A big part of what they were supposedly taught in these camps is about like Communist Party dogma. So basically, and also Xi Jinping thought, which is sort of even separate from that, like things that Xi Jinping believes and has said. And we interviewed people that were basically just given books of this and had to like sit there and like read them all day. And they were also, interestingly, they were taught in Chinese language. And some of these people were already like very fluent in Chinese, and others didn't know Chinese at all. But regardless, they were taught like entry level, kind of like beginner Chinese language. And like the issue is that they wanted to stamp out even the language. They didn't want them to speak their language, right? And like all of this happened, like the kind of broader history of this is that the government had worked for many years to shut down Uyghur language schools, even like kindergartens and things like that, bookstores, any cultural institutions in minority languages. It was trying to make everything in Mandarin Chinese. So like I would say like the kind of larger impetus behind this was just homogenization.
I wanted to comment that, for example, with different minority groups or ethnic groups, it's all at different levels. So, for example, in Tibet, children are forcibly sent to internalized boarding schools. In Inner Mongolia, for example, Mongolians had it fairly well for a long time, until very recently they were able to send their children to be educated in Mongolian schools, and now that has been stopped. So they are forced to attend school even from kindergarten and so it's just a kind of like incredibly relentless assimilatory pressure. At all times and affecting all minorities, even albeit at different levels. But it's like a steamroller.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I have one more question. First of all, thank you very much. I remember being mind-blown by this research on Venezuela, and now again I'm just like completely speechless about this whole research. But I was curious. I suppose after publishing this research, you are probably both back from China or from official searches. So I was just wondering, like, if it affected your continuing of the research, or are you allowed, like, is it now more complicated to continue work focusing on China, or how are you still like continuing this research, or?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we haven't been formally banned from China.
Have you tried to go?
No, and I wouldn't try. I wouldn't consider it to be safe to go there. There's just been so much. There has been like an escalation in the risks that journalists face within China. There've been a couple of Chinese nationals who are news assistants for large news organizations who have been arrested and essentially disappeared. There was one Australian citizen who was working for CGTN who was also arrested and I think accused of espionage. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There were Australian reporters who were given an exit ban, and they luckily learnt about it and managed to run to the embassy, and the embassy managed to get them out. But yeah, like being the least bad thing that can happen is that you lose your visa and have to leave. But these arrests and like they're arbitrary arrests, and arbitrary imposition of exit bans is a real issue. in terms of like continuing the work, we did all of this from outside of China because we had to. We were able, there's some things that you were able to do successfully, not everything. Like, it was, for example, it was amazing that Guan went to Xinjiang and drove around and like ground truthed our reporting. Since like 2017, what we have seen as well is like a slow shutting down of the information that is available online, and not just available. At first, it's come in kind of waves. At first, information about Xinjiang was getting shut down. So one of the reasons that we had to be so careful was that we knew that as soon as we published, all of the sources that we had used to find out what was happening, to corroborate our work, were likely to be lost to us. And we could document what we had seen, but like websites would be pulled down, tools that we had used would be like the web, like databases would be changed, so we no longer had access to the tools that we had used to do that research. That was something that people working to research China have like continuously faced over the past few years. It's become even more extreme recently. There's been new laws against espionage, new national security laws put in place, which have defined like an ever-growing amount of data as like critical to national security, and which therefore cannot leave China. And the sorts of people who are now getting caught in that net are people like McKinsey and like Bain Consulting. So these like big, very like commercial, international firms who do due diligence, and who you would imagine the Chinese government would want to support their work because they would want to support investment in China, and yet even they are now being targeted. And so it's very difficult for people to do any sort of research work that the Chinese government might consider sensitive. They also don't spell out what they consider sensitive. They leave everybody guessing. Also, in terms of like looking at social media, that can also be very difficult because there's a lot of like real name registration policies. You can only sign up with a Chinese mainland SIM card. You can only get that in China. You can only get it by showing your government ID, so it's linked to your identity. It makes research very, very difficult. So it's shutting down, but we haven't stopped trying. So, yeah.
Can I have one more small question? Have you been in contact with Trump?
Yeah, we managed to speak with him. I mean, we found this video that like everyone was talking about, and we were like, oh my god, like who is this guy? Like, of course, we really wanted to like speak with him. We managed to get in touch with him via Twitter and say hello and say like, hey, like thanks for the work you've done. This is amazing. We learned from that that he was safe. He didn't want to do an interview with us. Unfortunately, but you know, we respect that. Like, he's already taken a ton of risk. He doesn't need to take more. I spoke with him last about a year and a half ago, and I asked him for permission to use the video or his video in the film that we made for Venice, and he was like, yes, like do what you want with it. And then he wrote to me like, I don't know how to say this, so I'm going to say it in Chinese. And he like wrote a load of characters, and I put it into Google Translate, and it was like, I won't respond to any more messages. So I think he's done this incredibly brave thing, and needs to keep himself safe, and yeah.
But we don't know if somebody contact him and said to him, don't contact anymore these two girls. Like, we don't know this.
He's afraid. He must be afraid like Harold. He's about to be killed.
We have no idea what's happened.
We thinking if somebody just emailed him or called him or something and just said.
I mean, it's possible. yes, that's possible. We think that he may be a Chinese national, in which case he probably has family in China, but we don't know any of that. We believe that he's in a safe place. I think that like he was also somebody who knew exactly what risks he was taking as he did that, and really wanted to get this out. Yeah. So. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation as well. I just wanted to follow up the question with since you laid out the more difficulties and obstacles you're probably going to face with the next step. I just wanted to ask, what's the next step? Like, if it's the point of the research to like create more precision of the estimates of the layouts and how many people are internalized in these camps, like what is the, because you don't have the basic knowledge. So where are you planning on expanding?
So there's a few questions which are left over. I mean, one of them is just like what's happening now, right? It's like 3 years since we published the last story. End of 2019, the Chinese government announced that all of the camps had closed. We have seen reports that a small number have closed. There was one where the sign on the gate had been changed. Previously it said this was a camp, now it says this is a prison. So, we have a lot of questions about what is happening there now. There's a lot of forced labor in Xinjiang. People who weren't sent to camps were often drafted into like work teams often in like other parts of Xinjiang, to pick tomatoes, to pick cotton, or sent to factories both in Xinjiang and like elsewhere in China, which has done a lot to like break up those communities. Some of those products are making their way into Western markets. Solar panels is a really big one. Cotton, not into the US, but potentially into Europe. But like solar panels this is where most of the solar panels that we're using to manage the energy transition are coming from. So there's a lot of work that we can do like outside of China at the points where like China touches the rest of the world, and those supply chains is one. Yeah. So.
How do you improve their censorship? Have you noticed in the news that they're using something else than white square now?
They removed the white squares, disappeared sometime in like spring of 2020. So
before we published.
Before we published, like that kind of went away. Luckily, we'd managed to map them all by then. So they have shifted. They used to have like in Xinjiang very little imagery, and the imagery was old, and the imagery was like only medium resolution, and now they have like high resolution, slightly more up to date imagery. It wasn't very good censorship either. It was they made a map of all of the places that they didn't want anyone to look at. I think they've got a bit smarter.
Thank you for that talk, and I have a question. If you coordinated the publishing with other people that are working on it, or that that are still maybe working on it, because you said that the sources are then shut down probably almost all the time, so...
there's a relatively small community of people who are working on Xinjiang. A lot of the journalists who are working on it, they often are working in like reasonably traditional ways. A lot of people like who are traditional journalists who like talk to people and write about it. I think there's been academics, and there's been organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty who've been trying to do this research via documents, via procurement notices, via trawling social media, things like that. there wasn't a huge amount of coordination between the groups doing that, although increasingly we are talking to each other about like the fact that doing research on China is such a big problem and trying to work out what we can do about it. Yeah.
Okay. No more questions? Many thanks for coming and letting us exhibit this project. And there is a cafe/pub downstairs. I haven't managed to ask them whether they want to continue there, but like it's an option. And thanks everyone